What is consciousness? A journey between mind and cosmos. This is part 3 of our series on consciousness. And here we are at the end of our journey, or perhaps at the beginning, depending on how you look at it. We found that neither perspective alone can fully explain this amazing phenomenon. Neuroscience explains how the brain works and creates the experience of consciousness, but it cannot explain what that experience is like. Computer science describes the computational processes involved in creating conscious states, but it doesn't explain why those processes give rise to subjective experience. Parts 1 and 2, we discuss the nature of consciousness from 2 different perspectives, that of the neuroscientist and that of the computer scientist. How does the non-physical mind control the physical body? It comes from a philosopher named David Chalmers, and it's based on the idea that consciousness is a fundamental property of the universe, like mass or charge. Consider a glass of water. From a certain perspective, the glass of water is the water, and the glass is just a container that holds the water. We can study the brain and the world as much as we like, but we can't ever fully understand the relationship between them. If consciousness is a fundamental property of the universe, then it's not for anything. It just is. But maybe that's the point. Maybe the point of consciousness is that there is something that just is. But it's an agreeable mystery because we all share in it. Every one of us is conscious right now, and that means we can talk about it and think about it and wonder about it together. And that, I believe, is the point of consciousness. It's so that we can be together. Of course, this is a very different perspective from that of the computer scientist who wants to reduce consciousness to computable processes. But maybe both perspectives are right in their own way. Maybe we can understand consciousness as both a set of computational processes and a fundamental property of the universe. That's why we can never fully understand consciousness. Second, it means that consciousness is everywhere, or at least it can be. We started out by asking how the brain creates conscious experience, and we ended up saying that consciousness can't be created by the brain. But I think that's where we need to be. The brain and the world are 2 sides of the same coin. They're 2 different ways of looking at the same thing. The relationship between them gives rise to something that just is. Wherever there are brains that receive information from the world, there can be conscious experience. Third, this view also suggests that we can never have a purely objective understanding of the world. Our experience of the world is always colored by our consciousness. Even the scientific method is guided by our consciousness. We ask questions of the world and interpret the answers in terms of our own concepts. In short, this view of consciousness makes it impossible to draw a clear line between the mind and the world. The mind and the world are 2 sides of the same coin. They're 2 different ways of looking at the same thing. But from another perspective, the glass of water is the glass, and the water is just what fills the glass. In other words, the glass and the water are 2 different ways of looking at the same thing. Something similar goes for the brain and consciousness. Consciousness is the brain and the world looking at each other. It's the patterns in the brain interacting with the patterns in the world. The brain receives signals from the world through our sensory organs, and those signals are transformed into conscious experience in the cerebral cortex. But those signals aren't just data, they're information, which is something entirely different. Information is what you get when you take data and impose some kind of order on it. It's like the order of language or the order of a mathematical theory. We don't usually think of sensory signals as having any order, but they do. In fact, that's what makes them meaningful. For example, the color red is a certain range of wavelengths of light reflected from an object to our eyes. But the color red isn't in the object, and it isn't in the light waves. It's in the relationship between the object and the light. So too with consciousness. It's not in the brain. It's not in the world. It's in the relationship between the brain and the world. These properties are fundamental because we can't explain them in terms of anything else. We just observe that things have mass and charge, and that's it. We know that mass and charge can combine in various ways to produce gravitational and electromagnetic forces. But those forces themselves can't be explained in terms of mass or charge. They are what they are. Similarly, we can observe that neurons and brain processes have a certain structure and follow certain rules. But that doesn't explain how they create conscious experience. Conscious experience just is what it is. Some philosophers said the soul resides in some part of the body, like the heart or the brain, while others said the soul is spread throughout the body like fire through wood. Well, we've come full circle to this same problem. We've located consciousness in the brain. But the subjective experience of consciousness seems to be something entirely different from the physical processes in the brain. The question is, how do they interact? How does the brain create experience? So what do we find at the end of this journey between mind and cosmos? Before we get there, let me just say one more time how grateful I am to be on this journey with you. Let's start out by saying what it is not. It isn't a thing. Consciousness isn't a thing in the physical world or in the digital world. It isn't something we can point to or put in a box. We don't have a physical basis for consciousness in the brain or in the computer. As David Chalmers has put it, consciousness is nothing in particular. It isn't a material thing. It isn't a process that takes place in space and time, and it isn't reducible to anything else. In short, consciousness is a mystery. Your comments on parts 1 and 2 were so thoughtful and helpful in improving these videos. Thank you for being here. When you close your eyes and think about the red ball sitting on the table across the room, you know that ball is red without any doubt whatsoever. You also know that you're thinking about a ball, and you know what that thought feels like. In fact, you know everything about your experience right now, what you're feeling, what you're thinking, and what you're seeing in your mind's eye. You know all of that, just the way you know it, without being able to explain how you know it. And that is really strange when you think about it. How do you know what you know? You've all heard the expression, if you use it, you lose it. But when it comes to consciousness, the opposite is true. If you try to use your understanding of the brain or of computation to explain how you know what you lose it. Consciousness is lost in translation. So what is consciousness? But here's the thing, it's an agreeable mystery. In philosophy, there's a long tradition going back to ancient Greece of trying to explain how the immaterial soul can influence the physical body. So where does that leave us? There are many possible answers to this question, but I want to tell you about the answer that I find most compelling. If consciousness is fundamental, then it's not created by the brain or the computer. It's created by the relationship between the brain and the world. This view of consciousness has some interesting implications. First, it suggests that consciousness isn't something we can ever fully understand. This brings us back to the question we asked at the beginning of this series, what is consciousness for? I realize that this is a strange and even unsettling conclusion to come to. So what is consciousness? It's a mystery. Thank you for being here. See you next time.